Whilst Mortoon has always been a place that hissed beneath its surface with secrets and whispers, not all of the stories muttered between friends concerned the supernatural. Sometimes they were rumors and half-truths, tales and yarns spun about the quirky and eccentric souls living in the town. From Miss Liedel the knitting lady to John Hunt the weird old stonemason, it seemed that on every corner there was at least one character for the local kids to tease, talk about, or fear. One of these characters who was, for a long time, an object of ridicule was a guy named Joseph Mertz, or as the kids called him, Skinbone Joe the Feeder. The two parts of Joe's nickname actually evolved at separate points. The first part, Skinbone, was a reference to his skin and bone physique, owing to the fact that Joe was, to put it bluntly, a small and physically insubstantial man. Some would describe him as skinny, but whatever string of adjectives you decided to attach to his skeletal frame, one thing was clear: Joe was a painfully thin man. I remember an uncle of mine once commented that if Joe got any thinner, he would eventually only need one eye, which, considering his choice of life partner, was to us kids comically ironic. Miss Bernice, Joe's other half, was anything but skinny. In fact, she was the opposite, mostly because of Joe. Miss Bernice Roberts had at one time been a teacher at the local high school. Even then, in her early 30s, she was what generously could be described as a larger woman. So large, in fact, that the school was forced to ensure that her classes were always taught on the ground floor and that she was never asked to fill in for teachers who taught on the upper floors on account of how she was unable to climb the stairs. Miss Roberts was only at the school for 1 year of my time there before she retired from teaching altogether, around 6 months after she started her romantic relationship with Joe Mertz. For the first few months of their relationship, the pair were known around town mostly for the fact that Miss Roberts was a local celebrity and was recognized as having been a teacher for a number of years. After a while, however, the couple became a more notable sight because of the obvious and striking disparity in their body types. It was an often repeated joke that when the two walked down the street together, they looked like a number 10, with Joe being the straight line of the 1 and Bernice the circle of the 0. Though of course it wasn't long before the sight of them walking alongside each other was a thing of the past. You see, almost from the start of their time together, Miss Roberts, already of quite a considerable size, began to pile on weight. From 1 month to the next, she would seem to have almost doubled in size, her waistline and overall bulk increasing to such an extent that she would eventually need to move around town on a mobility scooter, as walking had become far too taxing for her. What made this dramatic increase in weight all the more striking was the frequency with which Skinbone Joe, who never seemed to eat himself, seemed to be forcing food in massive and never-ending volumes into his partner's mouth. I can honestly say that I don't think I ever saw the pair together when Joe was not handing Bernice some kind of snack. Sometimes it would be a pizza, resting in the basket of the scooter that Bernice would be fed as she wheeled slowly around town. Other times, chips in massive overflowing portions and stuffed into the poor woman's mouth in shoveled handfuls so large that it was a wonder to us that she didn't choke. But of course she didn't choke. Instead, she ate, and as consequence, she also grew and grew. So large and largely immobile did Miss Roberts become that us kids often made a game of trying to find the pair on Google Street View, knowing that when the photographs were taken of Mortoon, they were bound to have been in at least one. It became a joke to see how many times you could spot them on Street View or even Google Earth, zooming in on aerial photographs until it was possible to see the couple as if they were landmarks. Whilst all of this will seem very mean-spirited and even offensive towards those with weight issues, it is worth remembering two things. Firstly, that we were kids, and as sad as it sounds, cruelty is something that comes far too easy to kids. Secondly, it is worth mentioning that the majority of our sharp-tongued jokes were not directed at Miss Roberts herself, but rather at Skinbone Joe the Feeder. I think the term feeder to describe someone who would overfeed their partner because they found fat and obesity to be erotic or alluring entered our collective vocabularies via some documentary we saw on Channel 5. Whilst the label may not in truth have been entirely appropriate, it certainly seemed accurate and definitely stuck. As soon as the concept crystallized in our minds, Skinbone Joe became known as Skinbone the Feeder, or even just the Feeder. In our modern mythologies, Joe was definitely a feeder, who spent whole evenings planning the most fattening diet he could possibly compose for his wife, stuffing and gorging her with a hideous diet in a concerted and deliberate effort to make her as large and overweight as possible simply because her massive size, even in its most extreme form, was a turn-on for him. We created elaborate and wildly exaggerated menus that Joe was probably feeding her in an attempt to increase her mass and make her even hotter in his eyes. Hearsay that was not helped by the fact that Skinbone Joe, who had a physique like a pencil, was seen wearing a t-shirt which read, "The bigger the better." Once we saw that, there was no going back. In our minds, Joe was definitely a feeder who would like to continue to stuff his wife until she burst. It might have been true, it might not, but considering what actually happened to Miss Roberts, it seems there was at least some truth in it. After around a year, the strange couple began to be seen less and less frequently. This trend continued until eventually only Joe was seen and Miss Roberts seemed to have disappeared altogether. Though of course we all knew she was still around on account of the amount of food that Joe purchased every week. I remember, for example, that a friend of mine, Dylan, who worked in the local supermarket, told me that in one afternoon, and over the course of 3 separate trips, Joe had purchased every single tub of ice cream in the place. What made this story even more memorable was the fact that Joe had also visited the other big supermarket in Mortoon that day and purchased all of their ice cream too. In a single day, Skinbone Joe had virtually cleared the entire town of Mortoon of ice cream, and of course we had no doubt where all that ice cream was going. A month later, he did the same with chicken. The fact that Miss Roberts was no longer seen in public, of course, led to speculation as to her whereabouts. Our immediate conclusion was, of course, that she had become housebound, that she had ballooned to such a size on account of her partner's feeding fetish that she was no longer able to leave the house. For a while, there were far-fetched stories of people who had glanced in the windows of Joe and Bernice's home, peeking through the perpetually drawn curtains only to see a thing laying on the bed that no longer looked human. There were stories of a hideous stench coming from the house, which many attributed to the fact that Bernice could no longer leave the bed or bath. This, of course, was never confirmed, but with Joe still buying mountains of food, the conjecture became fact. Some people talked about how one day we would see Miss Roberts on her own exploitative freak show documentary, filmed as she was winched out of bed on her way for a stomach staple or a gastric band aimed to save her life. All whilst even more elaborate and detailed reports of Skinbone's shopping sprees became more and more frequent. When he was noted to have bought a single mattress, it was taken to mean that he was now sleeping separately to his partner because he could no longer fit in the same one with her. When he bought an expensive electric barbecue, it became obvious that he would be plying his partner with immense cuts of meat. It was only when Skinbone himself stopped being seen that the jokes and innuendos stopped too. Whilst Skinbone's absence obviously fueled the rumor mill and many stories were spread about the reasons for his sudden disappearance, the jokes dried up when it was suggested that Miss Roberts might have died. Certainly, the massive deliveries usually scheduled for the couple's home ceased abruptly along with the wisecracks. Suddenly, Joe became less a figure of fun and transformed virtually overnight into a focus of pity. It was not uncommon when someone mentioned Joe for people to say, "Oh, that poor man," or to otherwise express sympathy for his loss, despite the fact that Bernice's death had never even been confirmed. It was only around 3 months later, when Joe had not been seen leaving his house at all, that the sympathy began to morph into concern. Grieving was one thing, but as far as anyone could tell, Joe seemed to have entirely cut himself off from the world, which of course wasn't healthy. It was decided, though I'm not sure by who, that someone should go around to the house to check on Skinbone, to check that he was okay and most probably to ensure that he was actually feeding himself and hadn't completely wasted away. From what I heard, those calling on Joe received no response and, concerned by the appalling stench coming from the house, decided eventually to contact the police, who eventually took it upon themselves to break into the home and search for Joe. From what I heard, those calling on Joe received no response and, concerned by the appalling stench coming from the house, decided to eventually contact the police, who eventually took it upon themselves to break into the house in search of Joe. As it turned out, Skinbone was inside, though of Miss Bernice was no trace, save for the portion of her lower leg that was still grilling slowly on the barbecue. The last time I saw Skinbone Joe was on TV after he was arrested. I'll admit, when I saw the photos of the portly man in handcuffs, at first I didn't recognize him. It seems whatever Joe was up to in those 3 months, he had put on a considerable amount of weight. He had clearly been stuffing his face and eating well.